Hey everybody, welcome back to our next chapter and our ongoing exploration of the story by Randy Frazee. First off, big bold letters, New Testament, yay! Here we are moving into this next section as we are focusing in on chapter 21 entitled The Birth of the King, aka The Birth of Jesus, aka that dude right there. You can see in the background. What we read in this chapter hopefully all sounds pretty familiar to you. I would like to think it does, and it's somewhat familiar. It is a combination of information from 3 of the 4 Gospels. We start off the initial section, about a page or so, maybe just over, comes out of the Gospel of John, featuring what scholars call the prologue of John's Gospel, after which, once that prologue is done, it's like the first 17 verses of John chapter 1. And after that, then the narrative moves in with the adult Jesus and moving into his situations with John the Baptist and into his baptism and adult ministry. So just that initial portion comes out of John. We're also skipping Mark because very similar to with John, when the narration actually picks up in Mark, we also have John the Baptist and the adult Jesus. So there is no birth narrative in Mark whatsoever. So the rest of the chapter is a bit of a back and forth between portions of the narration that are found in Matthew and then portions that are found in Luke. And it's really a kind of an interesting little mix. The different parts that come out of Matthew includes the aspects that zero in on Joseph's experience, specifically the dreams in which he is warned about various things. Also the events of Epiphany and the Magi when they show up. Also items around Herod the Great. Including the event known as the slaughter of the innocents. That's the stuff that comes out of Matthew's gospel, and then the remaining portion comes out of Luke, and this includes the events of the Annunciation when Gabriel shows up to Mary, and also the Magnificat, the song that Mary sings. The actual birth narrative, and then the little bit of filler, like the bold section that's included in there that talks about Jesus' dedication and the events with Simeon and Anna. All of that comes out of Luke, as well as the final story that wraps up the chapter with the 12-year-old Jesus. That all comes out of Luke's gospel. Now, a side note to this. This combo of Matthew and Luke taking the various events and kind of smashing them together, even though it is kind of broken up. We'll go from one to the other, to the other, to the other. They're not really smashed together, and yet they kind of are. This is something that is known as harmonization, namely the different gospel accounts coming together, or they're mixed up like voices singing together in harmony, hence the name harmonization. Typically, scholars, the scholarly types will dissuade away from harmonization. But in this case, in the way that the story presents things, it's actually kind of helpful in this situation to see how this event included and affected different individuals and the way that God interacted with them in and around these different people, in and around these different events, some of which are recorded in Matthew, some of which are recorded in in Luke. So it is kind of helpful in this situation. Just kind of wanted to give that caveat that typically when we're zeroing in on a specific story, we like to try and keep things within the single gospel that we are focusing on and not harmonizing them together. But okay, we've said that. The setting is hopefully familiar. Right about 2,000 years ago-ish, give or take, right around the Christmas time, or at least the nativity time, depending on your point of view for what time of year Jesus was actually born. The gap since our last chapter is approximately 400 years. We talked about this in the last video, that after the Malachi, the events of Malachi, it's about a 400-year gap between the end of what we call the Old Testament and the beginning of what we call the New Testament. However, there are other quote-unquote scriptural sources from this period that do cover some of that time frame. Now, they're not included in the Bible as we know it, or what we call the canon or the biblical canon, aka Genesis through Revelation. We do not include those, but some of them are included in what we call the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha, that is a big fancy word. Perhaps you've heard it called the Catholic Bible. That includes some other alternate scriptural sources that we don't have included. When I think about the Apocrypha, I think it's good stuff. It's important stuff. It just didn't quite make the cut for the canon as we consider it. Now, I wasn't present at the councils that determined what canon or what would become canon and what wouldn't. So don't ask me why some things are in there and some things aren't. Without a lot of study, I would struggle to have an answer for that. But the takeaway from this is during that 400-year gap, we do have some sources that kind of shed some light into things, but we don't include them in the Bible as we have it. Okay, cool. You with me? Cool. All right. I'm going to go out on a limb. I kind of already mentioned this, but I'm going to assume that a lot of what we read in the chapter is pretty familiar, especially the narrative portion around the nativity. So I'm not really going to dive into that so much. I'll let you talk about that as you will. But I do want to share some things that make me go, some sort of side notes that stem out from this, some of things of that nature. First of all, one really important aspect of this as we consider, especially the narrative found that's in Matthew and then in Luke, is that this involved real people with real situations, with real problems, and some of which were experiencing some very epic turmoil. This is a question that actually came up in confirmation just within the last couple of weeks as I'm sitting down to record this, some questions in and around the experience of Mary and the experience of Joseph. Of course, there were other individuals that were involved as well, but what was going on with them? And we perhaps don't often tend to stop and really think about this, but there is a lot going on here culturally that is very, very problematic for them given the circumstances. Now, the question really originated, did Mary have to do this? And the answer to that seems to be no, but she did agree to it. When in the events of the Annunciation, when Gabriel came to her and said, this is what the Lord is asking of you, she says, okay. She has some questions, but she says, okay. But she is at great personal risk by saying yes to this. And on the flip side, Joseph is also facing some turmoil here as well. Now, the question is, what could Joseph do in this situation? And he really had three choices when it was found that his betrothed, Mary, to whom he was seemingly engaged but not yet married, when it's found that she is pregnant, he's facing three choices. One, he can order her death by stoning, which, ouch. Two, he can dismiss her. We hear about that he's considering doing that. Now, what it means to dismiss her is essentially just ending the betrothal. And this leaves Mary with what could best be described as a tainted status. I don't like that, but that's probably the best way of describing it. And she would remain in her father's house or that of a brother or whatever. She would remain in her family's home and she would be unmarriable. Given the circumstances. And the final option is what actually ends up happening, what the angel tells him to do: take her as your wife and raise the child as your own. And that is obviously what does happen, but they both would face very extreme cultural scrutiny for this situation. And what's interesting to consider, and I'm just kind of thinking out of the box here, is if they were already in Nazareth, with which Luke's gospel places them already in Nazareth as living there, and then continuing to live there, the stigma in and around Jesus and in and around Mary and in and around Joseph would follow them probably the entirety of their lives. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew's a little bit more ambiguous as to where they're living when things initially pick up. They actually make it sound like they don't end up in Galilee and Nazareth until after the whole Herod situation in and around Jerusalem, and they go off to Egypt for a few years. So given that circumstances, maybe it's a bit of a fresh start. No one knows our history, so we're okay here. But again, there's a little ambiguity in there, but there's a lot of cultural turmoil in and around this whole situation. I think something that we tend to forget about. Also, another thing that gives me pause: the threat to Jesus from Herod is very, very, very real. And this includes the section, the story, the very brief little snippet that we have known as the slaughter of the innocents. And what goes on there is Herod is so paranoid that someone is going to usurp his power that any threat to that is worth violently opposing. And so he orders the death of babies 2 years and younger. This is where we get the idea that the Magi may have showed up upwards of 2 years after the birth of Jesus. Just a side note there, but it reveals the truth that power is corruptive, And those who have it are oftentimes terrified of losing it. And because of that, innocent babies are killed. Now, we don't know how many children were killed in this situation. That was another question that came up within the confirmation class. How many kids were killed? We don't know. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and that's the setting of this situation. Now, Bethlehem at the time was basically a village. It was not a real big place. And close to, in proximity to Jerusalem, we might consider it a suburb of Jerusalem, but it may have only been a handful. It may have been a lot. It may have been only a couple. We don't exactly know, but regardless, innocent babies are killed because of this, and that should be something that gives us all pause. Last thing that I want to kind of zero in on is just a word about the way this chapter ends and the story of the 12-year-old Jesus. Comes again out of Luke's gospel. Only time, or the only bit of narrative that we have scripturally, I'll come back to that in a second, scripturally, that between the birth and babyhood, babyhood, that's a weird word, but between the birth narrative and that early life in and around Epiphany, and then when Jesus is fully grown, this 12-year-old portion is there. And I always kind of laugh at this because it seems like such an epic fail on the part of Mary and Joseph that they just leave Jesus unwittingly in Jerusalem. But there's some reason for this. And it's important that they point out that Jesus is 12. Now, at 12 years old, Jesus is on the cusp of adulthood. Within the culture, especially at that time, you became an adult at age 13. Well, he's not quite there yet. And so that combined with the way that people would have traveled in groups of large groups of people, it also culturally telling. So the men would travel in the front of the caravan and the women and children would travel in the back. Jesus is 12, so he's not quite an adult and he's not quite a kid. I think, I don't know, but I speculate that Joseph probably thought Jesus was in the back with the women and children. Mary probably thought that Jesus was in the front with the men, and neither one of them bothered to check until roughly a day later when they're looking around. It's like, where's Jesus? I thought he was with you. No, I thought he was with you. Oh no, where is he? And we have that whole situation. So epic fail for them both. But the other thing, all humor aside, that goes along with this is the idea that we see even from a young age that the spirit of the divine, the spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, the divine within Jesus, whatever we want to say, we see that it's already present and it's already beginning to manifest. And even at that young age, I think that's pointing forward to his ministry and what he will ultimately accomplish. That's everything I have. I actually got a little bit longer winded than I expected to, but a lot of great stuff in here. I'm excited to be into the New Testament now. So I will leave you to discuss things. Hope you have a great week. Take care, everybody.